التعافي مما خلفته جائحة كورونا على مدارسنا، ستكون السنوات القادمة حاسمة بالنسبة لصناع القرار لإعادة صياغة مستقبل الأجيال الجديدة وتنمية المجتمع واقتصاده بهدف إعادة هيكلة المدارس برؤى أفضل. اسمحوا لنا أن نرحب بوزير التعليم والعلوم السابق في البرتغال الدكتور نونو كراتو، وعنوان الجلسة مدارس من أجل المستقبل.
Thank you, Dr. Osama. The coming school years will be crucial for the future of the new generations and for the development of our economy and society. The only way to recover from the pandemic learning loss is to build forward better. We welcome our keynote speaker, former Minister of Education and Science in Portugal, Dr. Nuno Crato, in his session, Schools to Build the Future. Welcome, Dr. Nuno.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, all speakers and the Queen Rainier Teacher Academy. My greetings to all, and thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much, Dr. Osama Obeidet, for the invitation, and all of you for organizing this beautiful meeting and very interesting meeting on a very important topic. I'm going to share my screen and start my presentation. And as you can see, I hope you are seeing it well now, I'm going to talk about a topic that is inside this, this forum, which is transform schools to transform the future. The situation is not very, it's very serious. It's not very clear now where we are. And the pandemic disrupted our normal activities, but we already had before the pandemic some problems in education, very serious problems indeed. So many times we hear talking about a bright future and the next big thing. There is always a next big thing, and this next big thing maybe to start with students' interests, maybe to have a constructivist approach, maybe to always teach in context, maybe to take part of social emotional learning, incorporate it. Maybe it's to convey critical meaning to students, it's 21st century skills, you name it. So we are always having this type of messages. And of course, there is always something good in some messages, but we have to be aware that they are not the complete solution for our problems. And some of them are very questionable, such as to base everything on inquiry-based learning, or to base everything on projects, or to develop competence for getting knowledge, or even more contentious is the idea of multiple intelligences and learning styles, just to name a few of the things that have not been proven by science. On the opposite, they have been discarded as wrong approaches. Now, the situation is difficult, as I told you, and I think that our main motto should be to pay attention to the fundamental things. And when we are talking about fundamental things, we are talking about things that even before the pandemic were not complete problems that were not completely solved. And that's what we have to be aware of, is that pre-pandemic is not the paradise, and we have to move forward and pay attention to what happened before. So worldwide, before the pandemic, the UNESCO assessed and had this estimate that 50% of 10-year-olds were in math below minimum proficiency levels, and 58% of these same youngsters were reading below minimal proficiency levels. So this is really appalling. It means that we have lots of kids in the world who can't read basic texts, who can't do basic computations. And now the UNESCO is estimating something a little bit more serious after the pandemic, something like around 75%. So around 75% of students worldwide, we are talking here about 10-year students, are below minimum proficiency levels. This is a very serious thing, and it's very serious for our future. Now, P's and teams have some and some regional stats prompted some scientists to do an assessment, an overview of what's going on in the world, taking in consideration all assessments that we have. And this is newest. Sarah Gust, Eric Anushek, and Ludger Wassmann. Anushek, by the way, is the recipient of Edian Prize last year. And Anushek and Wassmann are some of the greatest economists of education in the world at this moment. They have studied this. Other great economists, such as Harry Patrinos, that you are going to listen as well in this forum, as well as Maciej Jabukovsky and other researchers, they have made some estimates before. So Patrinos and Angrist and their colleagues made some estimates. Now these are the newest estimates, and they go newest, I mean like 1 week old. So this paper was out 1 week ago, but essentially it reinforces the ideas that Angrist and Patrinos have already developed in their paper in Nature this fall. So taking into consideration these statistics, they estimate now that 66% of youngsters are below minimum proficiency levels. And this is the map of the world at this moment, the map that they built. And you see that the darker situation, the worst situation. So of course, in sub-Saharan Africa, situation is very serious, but even in the MENA region, so which should concern us directly, situation is not good enough. And just to say that. And in Latin America, the situation is also very worrisome. But this is the map of the world, and this is showing what the economists call education poverty. Education poverty is a classification that World Bank came with about 3 or 4 years ago. And essentially, this measure is saying who in the world cannot read at a reasonable level. And so education poverty means this, but it means a lot more, because if you can't read, we can't learn other things. Latin America, 65%, but even in Europe, in the United States, situation is not far from being perfect. In Europe, it's estimated that 25%, so a quarter of youngsters cannot read, cannot perform basic math in a reasonable way. Now, what's here in this map is the map of students in school who were in school or had finished school and still have all this trouble reading and understanding a simple text. Now, the next map is youngsters, all of them, and situation is a little bit worse, because here we are talking also about kids who never went to school or who stayed in school for just a few years and never really completed any degree. So if you compare this map with the previous map, you see the situation is slightly worse, of course, for those, if we incorporate those that are not in school and never completed a degree in school. But it also shows this is a double problem. And the problem is school access. So many kids still don't have access to school, but even those that have access to school don't have a school in quality, an experience in school with quality enough to become proficient readers. And of course, this is just the start of everything. So we should pay lots of attention to school quality as well. Access to school and school quality. As Hanushek said some time ago, it's a basic thing. It's not enough to be in school. You need to learn in school. If you are in school, it's not a good measure. What's a good measure is what you learn in school. So I was talking about Europe and PISA in the OECD, and we see also that OECD in general, so OECD countries have their PISA averages, and PISA is an assessment of 15-year-olds in 3 areas, reading, math, and science. You see that they have been decreasing. So you see that the average has been decreasing essentially after here. It depends on the subject, but it has been decreasing steadily. So this is worrisome. And if you talk about other statistics, is the increase of share of low performers, which is really very serious. And I'm talking about OECD and in Europe. So if you look at OECD, this is the share of low performance. So we see that about 20% of kids of 15-year-olds in the OECD countries, about 20% cannot read reasonably. And as you see, this is increasing. The share of low performers is increasing, which is very worrisome. And if you talk about the European Union now, you see the same thing. So the share of low performers is increasing, which means we are not in Europe doing a good job. So this is not only a problem for the poor countries. This is a global problem. Of course, we exclude from this problem the countries that are doing exceptionally well, such as Singapore, such as South Korea, such as Estonia, and so on. But most of the countries are not doing well. And now we have the pandemic. So what can we do now? The pandemic is over, we hope. And what can we do now? Well, what we need first is to measure what happened. It's not easy to measure what happened during the pandemic. There is a study made in the Netherlands, which is maybe still today the best study. And what they measured the learning loss, and they could measure the learning loss for a reason, is that they have measurement. They had testing. So they tested students, and they tested students before the schools were closed, and after the school, before the schools were closed, and after the schools were closed. And what happened is that they listed for math, for spelling, for reading, for low performing students, for social economic background, and so on. And their conclusion is essentially during this closure, essentially 8 weeks, so essentially they were lost. And this is the Netherlands, a place in which you have a covering of the internet, and all the remote learning was much easier to perform than in other countries. And this is not only a cost for education, it's a cost for the economy. And this has been assessed. I'm talking here about the same Anushek and Wassman, the same economists who wrote this report for the OECD early in September 2020. And you see that here, if you have it, this is free. If you want, you can access all these reports, and they show you the situation is a serious one. At Iniciativa Educação, where I work, this is our foundation institution for education in Portugal. We provide lots of information, both in Portuguese and in English, about all these subjects. And Harry Patrinos, whom I talked about before, made other assessments. And so we have some information about what happened after the pandemic and during the pandemic. But that information is not enough, because we need to go in each country and assess in each country what's going to happen and how we are progressing. This is very important. So how can we recover? First, we have to use the international data and experience. And this shows you that if you have an ambitious and well-structured curricula, then you progress faster. So this is the first thing, to have a well-structured curriculum. Then this is not enough. You have to provide additional help for struggling students. You don't just say, oh, they move as they move. We are ambitious, and if they are not able to keep up the pace, so bad. No, we have to break this dilemma that sometimes happens, that if you are ambitious, that some students are behind. If we are not ambitious, then not everybody learns at the pace they should. So, and the way to do it is to have an ambitious and well-structured curriculum on one side, and on the other side, to have additional help to these students so that all can attain a reasonable level. Of course, well-structured teaching works better for students. This is a conclusion that comes from all the inquiries in the OECD. Here we have a graph showing how important is, of course, students' socioeconomic profile. Then the index of teacher-directed instruction is very positive. The teacher, how do teachers direct their students? And inquiry-based instruction is really very terrible. It doesn't work at all. So this is a report from OECD. Sometimes we hear some people from OECD saying one thing. Let's look at the data they provide. The data doesn't lie, and the data shows that the situation is not good if we just don't do structured teaching. So structured teaching works better for students. So here, teacher explaining, teacher explains the relevance of science concepts are positive, while students just let that by themselves is not a good idea. Studies in cognitive psychology reinforce this idea. So this is not just some from statistics. It's something that comes from statistics and comes also from the science of learning, from the cognitive psychology. Now, I believe we are witnessing a scientific revolution in education studies now. First, because we have data. We have PISA, we have TIMSS, we have data from UNESCO, we have data from World Bank. So we have data. We are starting having data. Then because we have what's called economics of education, and essentially it should be called like statistical analysis of education, which won Nobel Prize 2 years ago. So David Card, Angrist, and Imbens gained this Nobel Prize for their studies in methods to disentangle the causality in a very complex environment such as is education and is society. Cognitive psychology, it's a really a great progress essentially on the 21st century. Late 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century were fundamental for knowing how our brain acquires knowledge. And then neurosciences are still promising, but they still have a long way to go, but they are providing some very interesting information about how our brain works. Now, I think that we have to do, as I said, we have to use international data, use a curriculum, a structured curriculum, give extra help to struggling students, have well-structured teaching, but we have to do a couple of things more, and I'm just highlight this. Assessment. Assessment is key. If we don't assess, we don't know how our students are. So we have to assess constantly. And coming out of the pandemic, we have to assess where they are, how they are progressing. Then if you use science, we say that we can build better, faster now, but how do you do it? One problem that has been discussed is this: should we remediate or should we accelerate learning? I'm for acceleration. Acceleration means we review things as they are needed, but we have to have a clear curriculum, clear goals, and fight for them, fight for our students to progress faster. This is there is a big discussion about it. I don't have time to explain exactly all these topics, but there are some data from this that say that classes where they accelerate learning, they really accelerate much and approach the level they should be much faster than classes that are just remediating. So how can we recover from pandemic? How can we build better and faster? First, be aware of fundamentals, reading, fundamental areas, reading, mathematics, geography, history, sciences. Be aware of these things. If we don't do it, we are not going to overcome the pandemic crisis. Then measure outcomes. Be always measuring. Be able to know where your students are and be able to know how you are progressing in your school, in your country, in your classes. Then look at students' levels. That means we should pay attention to those that cannot follow the class, those that are behind, but we should just not stay there. We should pull them up. So we have to have an eye on the students, an eye on learning goals. Thank you very much.